Welcome to The Explainer. We constantly hear about the individual battles, the famous generals, and the tactical maneuvers. But today, we're zooming out. We're going to unpack the systemic failures, the harsh economic realities, and the absolutely massive strategic blunders that structurally dismantled the Third Reich from the inside out.
So let's dive right into this massive historical paradox. At its peak, Germany controlled a staggering amount of territory, literally from the coast of France all the way deep into the Soviet Union. So how did a power that dominant end up completely, utterly destroyed, with its leaders hiding in a bunker in Berlin? Well, to really understand why Germany lost the Second World War, we have to look way beyond just the clashes on the battlefield. We need to examine the deeper, structural causes of their downfall.
And to answer that, we'll be exploring 5 definitive pillars today: ideology over strategy, the production gap, Eastern Front blunders, the power of Lend-Lease, and finally, the Allied bomber offensive.
Let's start with Pillar 1, ideology over rational strategy. We really have to start at the root cause here. Germany's defeat wasn't just a failure of troops or tanks. It was a total collapse in the decision-making process itself. Hitler's policies were entirely driven by this self-deluding, apocalyptic racism. He firmly believed Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union simply could not coexist in the same world. There was no middle ground. This wasn't a normal war for limited territorial gains. It was an ideological deathmatch, and that mindset completely clouded any rational military judgment.
Because of this rigid ideology, the German High Command routinely just discarded objective, rational assessments of their enemies. They totally ignored the classic military principle of flexible strategy, adapting when circumstances change. When operations were clearly failing, their ideology demanded that they refuse any kind of tactical retreat. Astonishingly, they preferred total destruction over a limited strategic defeat.
Moving on to Pillar 2, the production gap. That ideological inflexibility we just talked about, well, it forced Germany into a war it literally could not win economically. Now, you might assume the Soviet Union had this massively larger industrial base right from the start. But surprisingly, looking at non-agricultural workforces in 1939, they were actually really similar. We're talking about 29.2 million workers in Germany compared to 32.5 million in the USSR. Germany actually had a totally comparable resource pool, which makes their subsequent production failures even more staggering.
The real contrast is in how those workforces were utilized, and it's pretty wild. The German military treated their tanks almost like luxury artisan goods. They demanded high-quality, highly specialized weapons, and they were constantly tweaking and redesigning them. The Soviet philosophy was the exact opposite: relentless mass production. They sacrificed variety for sheer volume, using basically just 3 giant factories to crank out 2/3 of all their tanks. By 1942, this brutally efficient approach allowed the Soviets to completely outpace German war output. And adding to this massive inefficiency were some severe resource constraints. In fact, even before they invaded the Soviet Union, the German economy was already hitting a brick wall. By the spring of 1941, their coal stocks were virtually non-existent, which forced a 15% reduction in steel consumption. Keep in mind, this is long before the peak of the war. These severe early shortages basically permanently crippled their heavy industry's ability to keep up.
Let's look at Pillar 3, Eastern Front blunders.
Those production failures critically weakened the German army right at the exact moment they were making their most devastating strategic mistakes. In a really quick succession of blunders, Hitler diluted his forces across a massive 1,000-mile front. By failing to concentrate on Moscow in 1941, their advance just stalled out. Then, they got completely bogged down in the grueling urban warfare of Stalingrad, which ended in a massive surrender, and that was followed swiftly by the total failure of their final major offensive at Kursk. Stalingrad really is the defining moment here. The destroyed city forced close-quarters combat, which completely negated Germany's famous fast-moving blitzkrieg tactics. Worse, when the Sixth Army was surrounded, Hitler explicitly denied them permission to break out. Instead, he relied on an absolutely impossible promise from Hermann Göring to supply an entire trapped army by air. This stubborn refusal to allow a tactical retreat cost Germany its absolute best troops, and it permanently handed the strategic initiative right over to the Red Army.
Which brings us to Pillar 4, the power of Lend-Lease.
While the Soviets were bleeding the German army dry on the ground, a massive logistical pipeline was keeping the USSR in the fight, $50.1 billion. That staggering number is the total value of United States Lend-Lease aid shipped to the Allies. To put that into perspective for us today, that's roughly $700 billion, just given freely to keep the Allied war machine running.
Now, while Britain definitely received the lion's share of that aid, the $11.3 billion sent to the Soviet Union was an absolute lifeline. It provided the essential raw materials, the clothing, and the food necessary to sustain a Soviet economy that was incredibly burdened and deeply damaged by the initial German invasion.
But honestly, perhaps the most vital contribution was mobility. By the end of the war, 2 out of every 3 Red Army trucks actually came from Lend-Lease sources. Think about what that really means. Without these American trucks, rail engines, and train cars, practically every single Soviet counteroffensive would have outrun its supply lines in a matter of days. Historians estimate this incredible logistical support saved the Red Army from completely stalling out, potentially shortening the entire war by a year and a half.
And finally, Pillar 5, the bomber offensive. We absolutely must look at the crushing blow from above. This is what military historians often consider the actual second front of the war, long before D-Day even happened. The combined bomber offensive specifically targeted the German refined fuels industry. It was this massive, totally persistent campaign that created a catastrophic supply issue. Even Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, explicitly warned Hitler that the Allies had struck them at their absolute weakest point. And the numbers prove Speer completely right. By early 1945, relentless Allied bombing runs had just choked the life out of German industry, drastically reducing their overall fuel production to a mere 12% of what it had been just 1 year prior. Just 12%.
This kind of systemic destruction had a massive cascading effect. It crippled the German transportation network by 85%. Imagine the logistical nightmare they were facing. Infantry could only move by foot or by rail, and these newly manufactured high-tech tanks were left completely immobilized. They were literally just sitting useless on factory floors because they simply couldn't be transported to the front lines.
The strategic impacts here were devastating across the entire board. A sheer lack of aviation fuel meant the Luftwaffe had to cancel pilot training entirely. Crucially, it forced Germany to divert massive amounts of manpower and thousands of their best artillery guns back to the homeland just for air defense, effectively bleeding the Eastern Front dry. On the ground, entire offensives stalled out simply because they had absolutely no diesel left.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask, was Germany's defeat inevitable the very moment their ideology overrode rational strategy? When you weigh the incredible scale of Soviet mass production, the sheer volume of American logistics, total Allied air superiority, and the Third Reich's own stubborn inflexibility, we're left wondering if they had actually doomed themselves from the very beginning. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope this gave you a much clearer look into the actual mechanics of why Germany lost World War II.